Copenhagen, October 2, 1855. The autumn wind cuts through Sturgade as Søren Kierkegaard staggers along the cobblestones, his slight frame bent under the weight of 42 years spent wrestling with questions that have no comfortable answers. He has been walking these streets for hours, as he has every day for decades, but today his legs betray him. Passers-by notice the strange man in the threadbare coat stumbling near the old cathedral, the same building where his father once took him to contemplate sin and salvation. Kierkegaard collapses near the entrance to Frederick's hospital, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion that is both physical and spiritual. The man who wrote, "The most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have," now faces a future measured in weeks rather than years. Yet even in this moment of physical defeat, his mind remains relentlessly active, turning over the paradoxes that have defined his intellectual life. The crowd that gathers around him sees only an eccentric bachelor, a failed theologian who spent his inheritance on books and never held steady employment. They do not know they are witnessing the collapse of the man who would become the father of existential philosophy, whose exploration of anxiety, despair, and authentic existence would reshape how the modern world understands human consciousness. The individual who devoted his life to defending the importance of the single person dies unrecognized by the very crowds he spent his career analyzing. This was not merely the death of an obscure Danish writer. This was the moment when the 19th century's most penetrating analysis of modern alienation entered its final phase. The philosopher who insisted that truth must be lived rather than merely understood was discovering what it meant to live his own truth until the very end, even when that truth isolated him from every form of social comfort and recognition. Consider the impossibility. A man who preached passionate commitment spent his life in perpetual doubt about his own choices. A Christian philosopher who attacked the institutional church with such ferocity that he was banned from communion. A writer who argued against systematic thinking while producing one of philosophy's most systematic explorations of human consciousness. A defender of marriage who broke his own engagement to protect the woman he loved from the psychological intensity that made ordinary domestic life impossible for him. Yet to understand how these contradictions became the source of revolutionary insights about human existence, we must travel back 42 years to a household in Copenhagen where a successful merchant was teaching his son that existence itself was a problem requiring constant vigilance, and that the relationship between God and the individual soul was too important to be left to the comfortable explanations offered by conventional religion. The man dying on Sturgade had lived every day as if his eternal destiny depended on the choices he made in temporal circumstances. His collapse represented not defeat, but completion, the final act of a life devoted to the proposition that authentic existence requires the courage to face ultimate questions without the consolation of easy answers. Søren Kierkegaard was born into a world where doubt was a family inheritance and anxiety was mistaken for spiritual sophistication. May 5, 1813, in Copenhagen, the son of a wealthy wool merchant whose commercial success could not compensate for his conviction that he was living under divine judgment for sins committed in his youth. The Kierkegaard household on Nytorv Square was dominated by Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, a man whose intellectual gifts and religious intensity created an atmosphere where every conversation carried theological implications and every family meal became an occasion for philosophical investigation. The Denmark of Kierkegaard's birth was a small nation trying to maintain cultural independence while navigating the political upheavals that were reshaping Europe in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Copenhagen represented a unique intellectual environment where German philosophical idealism encountered Scandinavian Protestant tradition, creating fertile ground for the kind of synthetic thinking that would characterize Søren's mature work. Yet, the same environment also fostered the insularity and provincial concerns that Søren would spend his career both embracing and transcending. Michael Pedersen's influence on his son's development cannot be overstated. A man who had accumulated wealth through shrewd business practices while nurturing intellectual interests that ranged from theology to natural philosophy, the elder Kierkegaard embodied the tensions that would define Søren's entire worldview. Michael Pedersen could discuss the subtleties of Lutheran doctrine with scholarly precision while managing commercial enterprises with practical efficiency, but he remained haunted by psychological demons that financial success could not exorcise. The family's material prosperity allowed Søren access to the finest education available in Denmark while creating expectations for social and professional achievement that would prove incompatible with his intellectual temperament. The Kierkegaards lived comfortably in one of Copenhagen's most fashionable neighborhoods, employed domestic staff, and maintained the kind of respectable bourgeois lifestyle that successful merchants were expected to display. Yet, beneath this conventional surface, the household was permeated by religious melancholy and philosophical questioning that set it apart from its social milieu. And Søren's Lund Kierkegaard, Søren's mother, provided emotional warmth within a family structure dominated by her husband's intellectual intensity. Through her, Søren inherited a capacity for affection and human sympathy that would balance the abstract tendencies of his philosophical work. But Søren's also represented the conventional pieties and social expectations that Søren would eventually reject in his quest for more authentic forms of religious and personal commitment. The Copenhagen of Kierkegaard's youth was experiencing the cultural renaissance that would establish it as one of Scandinavia's most important intellectual centers. Hans Christian Andersen was creating the fairy tales that would make Danish literature internationally known. N.F.S. Grundtvig was developing the folk school movement that would reshape Danish education and national identity. Bertel Thorvaldsen was establishing Copenhagen as a center for neoclassical sculpture. Søren grew up surrounded by cultural creativity that was both inspiring and intimidating. The University of Copenhagen, where Søren would spend much of his young adulthood, represented the intersection of German idealist philosophy and Danish Lutheran theology that would provide the intellectual framework for his mature work. Professors like Hans Lassen Martensen and Frederik Christian Sibern were introducing Hegelian concepts to Danish academic culture while attempting to reconcile systematic philosophy with Christian revelation. This intellectual environment would give Søren the philosophical vocabulary he needed to articulate his insights, while also providing the systematic thinking he would spend his career attacking. But perhaps most importantly, Kierkegaard grew up in a culture that took Christianity seriously as an intellectual and existential problem, rather than merely accepting it as social convention. Danish Lutheranism, with its emphasis on individual conscience and the internal struggles of faith, created a religious environment where theological questions were understood to have practical consequences for how one lived. This cultural context would prove essential for Søren's development as a philosopher who insisted that religious ideas must be evaluated based on their existential rather than merely logical implications. The broader European context of Kierkegaard's intellectual development included the philosophical revolution initiated by Immanuel Kant and developed by German idealist thinkers like Hegel and Schelling. These philosophers had transformed traditional questions about God, freedom, and immortality into systematic investigations of consciousness, history, and the structure of reality itself. Søren would inherit this philosophical sophistication while rejecting the systematic aspirations that characterized German idealism. The social and political changes transforming European society during the early 19th century provided additional context for Kierkegaard's intellectual development. Traditional sources of authority, religious, political, and cultural, were being challenged by democratic movements, scientific discoveries, and philosophical criticism that questioned fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. Søren grew up during a period when inherited certainties could no longer be taken for granted and new forms of meaning had to be created through individual choice and commitment. Tonight, we follow Søren Kierkegaard through the labyrinth of consciousness that he mapped with unprecedented precision, tracing his journey from a melancholy child in bourgeois Copenhagen to the creator of existential philosophy. We will walk with him through the university lectures that first introduced him to systematic philosophy, into the drawing rooms where he honed his skills as a social observer, and finally to the solitary study where he produced works that would revolutionize how the modern world understands anxiety, despair, and the possibility of authentic existence. We begin with the household where every question led to deeper questions, and where a sensitive boy was learning that the search for truth might be incompatible with the desire for happiness, a lesson that would shape everything he would later write about the human condition. Chapter 1. The Merchant's Shadow. The house on Nytorv cast long shadows that seemed to follow Søren Kierkegaard throughout his childhood, creating an atmosphere where ordinary domestic activities were transformed into occasions for metaphysical inquiry. Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard ruled this household with the same methodical precision he applied to his commercial enterprises, but his authority was complicated by psychological burdens that no amount of financial success could diminish. 7-year-old Shren learned to navigate conversations where innocent questions about daily events could trigger theological discussions that lasted for hours. Michael Pedersen's study was the gravitational center of the family's intellectual life, a room lined with theological treatises and philosophical works that suggested learning was the family's true business rather than the wool trade that financed their comfortable lifestyle. Here, Shren received his earliest education in the art of dialectical thinking, observing how his father could argue multiple sides of complex questions with equal facility, while never losing sight of the moral and religious stakes involved in abstract philosophical problems. The evening routine in the Kierkegaard household reflected Michael Pedersen's conviction that family life should serve higher purposes than mere domestic comfort. After dinner, the family gathered for discussions that combined religious instruction with intellectual exercise, transforming their living room into a kind of domestic academy. Shren watched his older brothers participate in these conversations with varying degrees of enthusiasm and success. Learning early that intelligence was valued above conventional social skills in his family's private world, Michael Pedersen's business dealings provided Shren with his first glimpse of how economic relationships were structured by moral and psychological factors that remained largely invisible to participants. The customers who visited their shop treated Michael Pedersen with the deference due to a successful merchant, but Shren could observe how his father's interactions were complicated by internal conflicts that wealth and social status could not resolve. Every transaction seemed to carry implications that extended beyond its immediate commercial purpose. The family's social position in Copenhagen society exposed Shren to the complex relationship between public respectability and private authenticity that would become central to his philosophical work. The Kierkegaards maintained the external appearances appropriate to their economic status while harboring intellectual and religious concerns that separated them from their bourgeois neighbors. Shren learned to recognize the gap between social performance and inner reality that characterized middle-class life. Michael Pedersen's relationship with the Lutheran Church revealed additional layers of complexity that shaped Shren's early understanding of religious institutions and personal faith. The elder Kierkegaard attended services regularly and supported church activities financially, but his private theological interests extended far beyond conventional parish religion. Shren observed how his father could participate in official religious observances while maintaining critical distance from institutional Christianity. The periodic visits from family relatives provided Shren with alternative models of adult possibility that contrasted with his father's intense intellectuality. Uncle Niels Andersen Kierkegaard, who managed family business interests in the countryside, represented a more conventional masculine identity centered on practical achievement and social integration. These encounters suggested to Shren that his family's preoccupation with philosophical questions was not the only way to navigate adult responsibilities. Shren's formal education at the School of Civic Virtue on Ulvestad Street placed him in contact with boys from similar bourgeois families while emphasizing the classical learning that Danish intellectuals considered essential for cultural sophistication. Latin and Greek provided access to ancient philosophical texts that Shren read with increasing enthusiasm, discovering in classical authors like Socrates and Cicero models for how intellectual inquiry could be combined with moral seriousness. The school's emphasis on rhetorical training gave Shren his first systematic instruction in the arts of persuasion and argument that would later characterize his philosophical writing. He learned to construct logical arguments, analyze opposing positions, and present complex ideas in accessible language. These skills would prove essential for his mature work as a philosopher who insisted that abstract ideas must be communicated in ways that engaged readers' existential rather than merely intellectual interests. Michael Pedersen's periodic episodes of melancholy provided Shren with first-hand observation of how psychological conditions could affect even the most intellectually capable individuals. During these periods, his father would withdraw from family interactions and spend days in solitary reading and contemplation. Shren learned that intelligence and success offered no protection against forms of suffering that remained mysterious even to those who experienced them. The family library exposed Schren to intellectual traditions that extended far beyond the conventional curriculum of Danish education. Works by German philosophers, English empiricists, and French moralists suggested that serious thinking required engagement with perspectives that challenged comfortable assumptions about human nature and social arrangements. Reading became for Schren a form of intellectual adventure that was both exhilarating and unsettling. Schren's earliest attempts at writing reflected his family's emphasis on clarity and precision in the expression of complex ideas. His school compositions demonstrated unusual sophistication in their analysis of assigned topics while revealing personality traits that would characterize his mature work. Intense self-consciousness, ironic humor, and persistent questioning of conventional wisdom. Teachers recognized unusual intellectual gifts while noting psychological traits that suggested unconventional developmental patterns. The death of Schren's mother when he was 21 moved the primary source of emotional warmth in a household already dominated by intellectual intensity. And Schrensdatter's passing intensified Schren's relationship with his father while eliminating the domestic influences that might have encouraged more conventional forms of social development. The loss confirmed Schren's growing sense that life's most important experiences involved separation and loss rather than fulfillment and satisfaction. Michael Pedersen's increased attention to Schren's education following his wife's death reflected both genuine concern for his son's development and recognition that Schren possessed intellectual gifts that deserved serious cultivation. Father and son began taking daily walks through Copenhagen that became opportunities for extended philosophical discussions. These conversations introduced Schren to ways of thinking that combined rigorous analysis with passionate commitment to ultimate questions. Schren's adolescent rebellion against his father's authority took intellectual rather than behavioral forms, as he began developing philosophical positions that challenged Michael Pedersen's theological certainties while respecting his analytical methods. These family debates provided Schren with practice in the kind of dialectical thinking that would characterize his mature work, teaching him how to explore contradictory perspectives without losing commitment to the search for truth. The household's atmosphere during Schren's late adolescence was marked by increasing recognition that he possessed extraordinary intellectual gifts combined with psychological traits that might make conventional career success difficult. Michael Pedersen encouraged his son's philosophical interests while worrying about their practical implications for his future social and economic prospects. This tension would define Schren's relationship to Danish society throughout his adult life. Søren Kierkegaard was learning that intellectual honesty might require the rejection of conventional social expectations and that the pursuit of truth could lead to forms of isolation that made ordinary human relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. The merchant's house on Nytorv was preparing him for a life devoted to questions that society preferred to leave unexamined. Chapter 2. University Dialectics. The University of Copenhagen in 1830 represented everything that attracted and repelled Søren Kierkegaard about institutional intellectual life. Rigorous scholarship combined with social conformity, philosophical sophistication constrained by academic politics, and the promise of systematic knowledge that might resolve ultimate questions through methodical inquiry. At 17, Schren entered this environment with expectations shaped by years of private philosophical discussion with his father, only to discover that university education involved forms of intellectual compromise that challenged his commitment to absolute honesty in the pursuit of truth. Professor Frederick Christian Sibberne's lectures on philosophy introduced Schren to the systematic approach to human consciousness that German idealist thinkers had developed in their attempts to overcome the limitations of Enlightenment rationalism. Sibberne presented Hegelian dialectics as a method for reconciling contradictory perspectives through synthetic thinking that could encompass opposing viewpoints without eliminating their essential tensions. Schren found this approach simultaneously compelling and frustrating, intellectually sophisticated, but potentially evasive of the existential decisions that philosophy should illuminate rather than defer. Hans Lassen Martinsen, who taught theology and would later become Schren's intellectual rival, embodied the academic synthesis of German philosophy and Danish Lutheran tradition that characterized Copenhagen's intellectual culture during the 1830s. Martinsen's lectures attempted to demonstrate how Hegelian concepts could be used to defend Christian revelation while accommodating rational criticism of traditional religious doctrine. Schren admired Martinson's scholarly sophistication while questioning whether systematic philosophy could address the personal urgency that made religious questions meaningful for individuals. Schren's academic performance during his university years reflected his intellectual gifts while revealing psychological traits that would complicate his relationship to institutional life. Throughout his career, he excelled in examinations that tested mastery of complex philosophical systems while struggling with practical requirements like regular attendance and routine assignments. Professors recognized exceptional analytical abilities combined with temperamental characteristics that seemed unsuited for conventional academic or professional careers. The social environment at the university exposed Schren to peer relationships that were simultaneously stimulating and alienating. Fellow students appreciated his intellectual contributions to informal discussions while finding his intensity and ironic humor unsettling in ordinary social interactions. Schren learned that his combination of analytical penetration and existential seriousness created social dynamics that made casual friendship difficult to maintain while attracting individuals who shared his commitment to ultimate questions. Schren's first systematic encounter with Hegelian philosophy occurred during his university years, as Danish academics were discovering how German idealist concepts could be adapted to address traditional Scandinavian intellectual concerns. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit promised a comprehensive account of human consciousness that could reconcile individual subjectivity with objective truth. Schren initially embraced this approach while gradually developing reservations about systematic thinking that would eventually lead to his mature critique of philosophical systems. The student societies that flourished at the university during the 1830s provided Schren with opportunities to practice the skills of public speaking and intellectual debate that would later characterize his philosophical writing. Organizations like the Student Association created forums where political, philosophical, and literary questions could be discussed with the freedom that was not available in formal academic settings. Schren participated actively in these debates while maintaining critical distance from the group loyalties they generated. Schren's reading during his university years extended far beyond the official curriculum to include works by authors who would profoundly influence his intellectual development. Friedrich Schleiermacher's exploration of religious feeling provided alternatives to rationalist approaches to theology. German Romantic poets like Heinrich Heine offered models for combining philosophical insight with literary artistry. These influences suggested possibilities for intellectual work that transcended conventional academic categories. The political developments that transformed European society during Schren's university years provided practical context for abstract philosophical discussions about freedom, authority, and social change. The July Revolution in France and the November Uprising in Poland demonstrated how philosophical ideas about human rights and national sovereignty could motivate revolutionary political action. Schren observed these events with the fascination of someone who understood their theoretical significance while remaining skeptical about political solutions to existential problems. Schren's relationship with his professors reflected the complex dynamics that would characterize his lifelong engagement with intellectual authority. He respected their scholarly achievements while questioning whether academic philosophy could address the personal dimensions of ultimate questions. This ambivalence toward systematic thinking would eventually lead to his development of philosophical methods that combined rigorous analysis with existential urgency in ways that academic philosophy could not accommodate. The examination system at the university required Schren to demonstrate mastery of philosophical positions that he had begun to question on existential rather than purely logical grounds. He could present Hegelian arguments with scholarly precision while privately developing reservations about systematic approaches to human consciousness. This experience taught him to distinguish between intellectual understanding and personal conviction in ways that would prove central to his mature philosophical work. Schren's social life during his university years was complicated by family wealth that allowed him to maintain expensive tastes while pursuing intellectual interests that offered no prospects for financial independence. He could afford to attend theater performances, purchase books, and participate in cultural activities that were beyond the means of most students. This financial freedom created additional distance from peers while reinforcing his sense that serious intellectual work might be incompatible with conventional professional careers. The theological curriculum at Copenhagen required systematic study of Lutheran doctrine and church history that provided Schren with scholarly foundation for his later critique of institutional Christianity. He learned to analyze religious traditions with academic objectivity while maintaining personal engagement with faith as an existential problem. This combination of theological sophistication and religious earnestness would prove essential for his mature work as a Christian philosopher who attacked conventional church practices. Schrenn's earliest literary efforts during his university years included essays and reviews that revealed developing skills as a philosophical writer who could combine analytical rigor with literary artistry. His prose style already displayed the ironic humor and psychological penetration that would characterize his mature work. Teachers and fellow students recognized unusual literary gifts while noting that his writing was difficult to classify according to conventional academic genres. The completion of Schrenn's university degree in 1840 marked the end of formal academic education while beginning a period of intellectual independence that would prove both liberating and isolating. He had acquired philosophical sophistication that equipped him for serious intellectual work while developing critical perspectives on systematic thinking that would separate him from contemporary academic culture. The university had given him tools for analyzing ultimate questions while confirming his suspicion that institutional knowledge might be incompatible with existential truth. Søren Kierkegaard emerged from university education with exceptional intellectual preparation for philosophical work combined with psychological traits that would make conventional academic or professional careers increasingly impossible. The dialectical skills he had learned would be applied to questions that transcended academic philosophy while creating forms of isolation that formal education had been unable to prevent or address. Chapter 3: The Great Earthquake in 1838. When Søren Kierkegaard was 25 years old, he discovered a secret about his father that transformed his understanding of their relationship and shattered his confidence in the moral foundations of their family life. The exact nature of what Søren learned remains historically uncertain, but its psychological impact was catastrophic. He would later refer to this revelation as the Great Earthquake that destroyed his childhood faith and paternal authority, and forced him to reconstruct his entire worldview from premises he could trust from personal experience rather than inherited conviction. The revelation apparently concerned Michael Pedersen's conduct during his youth in rural Jutland, possibly involving premature sexual relationships or religious doubts that contradicted the pious image he had maintained throughout Schrenn's childhood. Whatever the specific content, the discovery forced Schren to recognize that the father he had revered as a model of moral and intellectual integrity was capable of hypocrisy that extended over decades and affected every aspect of their family relationships. Schren's initial response to this revelation was a period of rebellion that included excessive drinking, attendance at parties that his family considered beneath their social status, and deliberate adoption of behaviors designed to signal his rejection of the moral standards that Michael Pedersen had imposed on their household. Yet even during this period of apparent dissolution, Schren maintained his intellectual interests and continued the philosophical investigations that would eventually provide him with resources for understanding the psychological dynamics he was experiencing. The theological implications of his father's moral failure created additional layers of crisis that extended beyond immediate family relationships to fundamental questions about religious authority and spiritual guidance. Schren had learned to approach Christianity through his father's interpretation of Lutheran doctrine, but the discovery of paternal hypocrisy raised questions about whether religious conviction could coexist with moral compromise. The crisis forced him to distinguish between institutional religious authority and personal spiritual experience in ways that would prove central to his mature philosophical work. Schren's exploration of Copenhagen's social life during this period provided him with first-hand observation of bourgeois society that would inform his later critique of conventional morality and social conformity. He attended social gatherings where he could observe how individuals navigated the gap between public respectability and private desires, developing insights into the psychological mechanisms that enable people to maintain comfortable illusions about their own moral consistency. The financial resources that his father's commercial success had provided allowed Schren to pursue this social experimentation without facing immediate consequences for his behavior. He could afford to maintain expensive habits while avoiding the practical responsibilities that might have forced him to develop more disciplined approaches to adult life. This freedom created opportunities for philosophical reflection while potentially delaying the kind of existential commitments that his mature philosophy would identify as essential for authentic existence. Schren's relationship with his father during this period was characterized by a complex mixture of continued intellectual respect and profound moral disappointment. Despite his disillusionment with Michael Pedersen's moral integrity, Schren continued to value their philosophical discussions while losing confidence in his father's authority to provide guidance about ethical and religious questions. This paradoxical situation taught him to distinguish between intellectual capacity and moral wisdom in ways that would influence his understanding of philosophical authority. The psychological toll of maintaining this double relationship with his father, continuing intellectual engagement while processing moral disillusionment, contributed to forms of anxiety and depression that Schren would later analyze as characteristic responses to the modern condition of living without reliable external sources of moral authority. His personal experience of spiritual crisis provided existential foundation for philosophical insights that might otherwise have remained merely theoretical. Schren's academic work during this period suffered as he struggled to maintain motivation for systematic study, while questioning the value of institutional knowledge that seemed to offer little guidance for addressing the kinds of moral and existential problems he was confronting in his personal life. His professors noted declining performance while remaining impressed by his intellectual gifts and analytical penetration when he did apply himself to philosophical problems. The gradual recognition that his father's moral failure might be understood as a manifestation of universal human limitations rather than personal hypocrisy began Schren's movement toward the psychological insights that would characterize his mature work. Instead of condemning Michael Pedersen for failing to meet impossible standards of moral consistency, Schren began exploring how individuals navigate the gap between their ethical aspirations and their actual behavioral capacities. This shift in perspective was facilitated by Schren's reading of authors who had explored similar themes of moral complexity and spiritual struggle. Augustine's Confessions provided a model for understanding how personal spiritual crisis could be transformed into universal insights about human nature. Pascal's Pens Es suggested how mathematical and scientific intelligence could coexist with profound religious uncertainty. These influences helped Schren develop frameworks for understanding his family crisis in broader terms. Schren's gradual reconciliation with his father occurred not through forgiveness or forgetting, but through deeper understanding of the psychological conditions that make moral failure inevitable for finite beings who aspire to infinite standards. This reconciliation process taught him to approach ethical questions with compassion for human limitation while maintaining commitment to moral seriousness. The experience provided existential foundation for his later exploration of sin, guilt, and redemption. The Great Earthquake ultimately strengthened rather than weakened Schren's relationship with his father by forcing both men to engage with each other as fallible human beings rather than maintaining the idealized roles that had characterized their earlier relationship. Michael Pedersen's acknowledgement of his moral failures allowed for more honest communication, while Schren's acceptance of human limitation enabled more realistic expectations about what paternal guidance could provide. The philosophical implications of this family crisis extended far beyond immediate psychological healing to fundamental questions about the sources of moral authority in modern societies, where traditional religious and social institutions no longer command and question respect. Schren's experience suggested that authentic ethical commitment might require individuals to take personal responsibility for their moral choices rather than relying on external authorities for guidance. The transformation of his relationship with paternal authority prepared Schren for his later critique of systematic philosophy and institutional Christianity, both of which seemed to promise forms of certainty that his personal experience suggested were impossible for finite beings. The Great Earthquake taught him that existential truth might be incompatible with the systematic completeness that academic philosophy and organized religion claimed to provide. Søren Kierkegaard emerged from this period of family crisis with psychological insights that would prove essential for his development as an existential philosopher who insisted that authentic existence requires individuals to accept responsibility for their choices without the comfort of external authorities that guarantee the correctness of their decisions. The Great Earthquake had destroyed his childhood faith, while providing foundation for the mature philosophical work that would explore what it means to live with ultimate questions that have no comfortable answers. Chapter 4. Regina Olsen, on May 8, 1837, outside Sturbro Church following Sunday morning services. 24-year-old Søren Kierkegaard first saw Regina Olsen and experienced what he would later describe as the defining emotional event of his adult life. Regina was 14 years old, the daughter of a distinguished civil servant, possessed of an intelligence and vitality that immediately captivated Søren despite their difference in age and social circumstances. The attraction he felt was so intense and immediate that it convinced him he had encountered the possibility for the kind of passionate commitment that his philosophical investigations suggested was essential for authentic existence. Regina represented everything that Søren's intellectual life had taught him to value: spontaneous emotional responsiveness, natural grace in social situations, and apparent freedom from the self-consciousness that complicated his own interactions with others. Where Søren's mind worked through infinite layers of reflection and analysis, Regina seemed to possess intuitive understanding that bypassed psychological complications. Observing her interactions with family and friends, Søren recognized qualities of immediate presence and emotional directness that he admired but could not emulate. The 3-year courtship that preceded their engagement in 1840 provided Søren with opportunities to study the psychological dynamics of romantic love, while experiencing emotions that transcended his capacity for analytical understanding. His letters and diary entries from this period reveal a man attempting to use philosophical concepts to comprehend feelings that resisted intellectual categorization. Love, he discovered, involved forms of commitment that could not be justified through rational argument or systematic analysis. Søren's intellectual sophistication created complications in his relationship with Regina that she could not have anticipated when she accepted his proposal of marriage. His tendency to transform every conversation into an occasion for psychological analysis made ordinary domestic interaction difficult, while his preoccupation with ultimate questions made the kind of light social conversation that Regina enjoyed seem somehow trivial. Yet Regina's acceptance of these characteristics suggested depths of understanding that surprised and delighted Søren. The engagement period revealed fundamental incompatibilities between Søren's psychological needs and the requirements of conventional domestic life that would eventually make their marriage impossible. Søren required solitude for the kind of intellectual work that had become central to his identity, while Regina reasonably expected the kind of emotional availability that marriage typically involves. Neither could compromise their essential needs without sacrificing what made them attractive to the other. Søren's family background had provided him with few models for successful intimate relationships, as Michael Pedersen's intensity and intellectual preoccupations had created household dynamics that were intellectually stimulating but emotionally demanding. Søren inherited his father's capacity for passionate intellectual engagement while lacking experience with the kinds of emotional regulation that sustained intimate relationships require. Regina's family, by contrast, modeled conventional bourgeois domesticity that seemed both attractive and incomprehensible to Søren. The psychological pressure of maintaining an engagement while recognizing his incapacity for conventional marriage created forms of anxiety that Søren would later analyze as characteristic responses to situations where ethical commitment conflicts with psychological limitations. He wanted to fulfill his obligations to Regina while recognizing that marriage might require him to sacrifice the intellectual independence that made his commitment to her possible in the first place. Regina's emotional development during their engagement reflected her growing understanding of Søren's psychological complexity, combined with her determination to maintain optimism about their future together. She recognized his unusual intellectual gifts while hoping that love could overcome whatever psychological obstacles prevented him from committing fully to their relationship. Her letters reveal a woman attempting to love someone whose deepest needs she could understand but not share. Søren's decision to break their engagement in October 1841 was motivated by his conviction that marriage would be unfair to Regina given his psychological constitution and intellectual commitments. Rather than explaining his reasoning, which would have required Regina to share responsibility for the decision, Søren chose to present himself as unworthy of her love in ways that allowed her to maintain dignified anger rather than self-blame. This deception was both cruel and compassionate. Cruel in its immediate impact, compassionate in its long-term protection of Regina's self-esteem. The aftermath of the broken engagement transformed Søren's relationship to Copenhagen society in ways that would prove both liberating and isolating. His treatment of Regina was widely condemned as dishonorable, creating social ostracism that freed him from conventional expectations while making ordinary community participation increasingly difficult. He became a figure of public curiosity and private disapproval, who could no longer navigate social situations without encountering judgment about his personal conduct. Regina's response to the broken engagement revealed psychological resilience that earned Schren's continued admiration even after he had concluded that their marriage was impossible. Instead of retreating into victimhood or bitterness, she maintained social engagement while protecting her emotional privacy in ways that demonstrated maturity beyond her years. Her eventual marriage to Frederick Schlegel suggested successful adaptation to circumstances that could easily have produced permanent disillusionment with intimate relationships. Schren's continued observation of Regina's life from a distance provided him with evidence that his decision to end their engagement had enabled rather than destroyed her possibilities for happiness. Her successful marriage and social integration confirmed his conviction that their psychological incompatibilities would have made their marriage mutually destructive, despite their mutual affection. This recognition allowed him to interpret his painful decision as necessary rather than merely selfish. The intellectual consequences of Schren's relationship with Regina extended far beyond immediate emotional impact to fundamental questions about the compatibility of passionate commitment with reflective consciousness. His experience suggested that the kind of self-consciousness required for serious philosophical work might make the spontaneous emotional availability that intimate relationships require psychologically impossible. This insight would prove central to his mature analysis of the relationship between aesthetic, ethical, and religious stages of existence. Schren's philosophical exploration of his relationship with Regina produced some of his most penetrating insights into the psychology of romantic love and the social institutions that attempt to regulate intimate relationships. Marriage, he concluded, was designed for individuals who could commit themselves fully to domestic life without sacrificing other forms of meaning that made such commitment valuable. His own psychological constitution made this kind of total commitment impossible without self-betrayal. The transformation of Schren's love for Regina into philosophical insight about the nature of human relationships exemplified his mature approach to existential questions that combined personal experience with universal analysis. His specific situation illuminated general problems about how individuals navigate conflicts between competing forms of commitment that cannot be reconciled through rational compromise. The personal became universal without losing its existential urgency. Regina Olsen had taught Søren Kierkegaard that authentic love might require renunciation when circumstances make mutual fulfillment impossible, and that the highest form of commitment to another person sometimes involves accepting separation rather than demanding possession. Their relationship provided existential foundation for philosophical insights about sacrifice, responsibility, and the ethical dimensions of personal choice that would characterize his mature work as a thinker who insisted that truth must be lived rather than merely understood. Chapter 5, Either or. In February 1843, Danish readers discovered a mysterious two-volume work titled Either or, authored by someone calling himself Victor Eremite, who claimed to have found the manuscripts in an old secretary desk purchased from an estate sale. The real author, Søren Kierkegaard, had created his first masterwork of philosophical literature, a revolutionary exploration of human consciousness that presented competing approaches to existence through the perspectives of two fictional characters whose psychological portraits would establish the conceptual framework for modern existential philosophy. The aesthetic stage of existence, represented by the papers of A, offered readers access to a sophisticated hedonist who approached life as an art form devoted to the cultivation of interesting experiences. A's writings included essays on music, reflections on romantic seduction, and psychological analyses of boredom that revealed an individual who possessed considerable intellectual and cultural sophistication while remaining committed to immediate pleasure as the ultimate criterion for evaluating life choices. A's Diary of a Seducer, which concludes the first volume, provided Kierkegaard with opportunities to explore the psychology of romantic manipulation while analyzing how aesthetic consciousness transforms human relationships into occasions for artistic experimentation. The Seducer approaches his relationship with Cordelia as a creative project where the goal is not mutual satisfaction, but the production of interesting psychological states that justify the relationship in purely aesthetic terms. Judge William, whose letters dominate the second volume, represented the ethical stage of existence characterized by commitment to universal moral principles and social institutions, like marriage, that provide stable frameworks for moral development. The judge defended conventional bourgeois morality not as mere social conformity, but as necessary structure for the cultivation of authentic selfhood through sustained commitment to responsibilities that transcend immediate inclination. The tension between aesthetic and ethical approaches to existence that structures either or reflected Kierkegaard's own psychological struggles during the period following his broken engagement with Regina Olsen. He could understand the appeal of both approaches while recognizing that each involved forms of limitation that made complete human fulfillment impossible. The work presented these limitations as inherent features of finite existence rather than problems that could be resolved through better thinking or improved social arrangements. Kierkegaard's use of pseudonymous authorship allowed him to explore psychological positions that he could understand empathetically without endorsing personally. Writing as Victor Eremita, and Judge William enabled Kierkegaard to present competing perspectives with equal sophistication while maintaining ironic distance from all systematic positions. This literary strategy would become characteristic of his philosophical method, which emphasized the importance of indirect communication for addressing existential questions. The Danish reading public's response to Either or revealed the work's immediate cultural impact while demonstrating how philosophical literature could address practical questions about how to live that academic philosophy typically avoided. Readers recognized psychological insights that spoke to their own experience of choosing between competing values and conflicting commitments. The work achieved popular success while maintaining intellectual sophistication that impressed professional philosophers. The aesthetic consciousness that it represents was not merely hedonistic self-indulgence, but sophisticated appreciation for beauty, pleasure, and cultural refinement that characterized the highest achievements of European Romantic culture. A's essays on Mozart and his analysis of dramatic literature demonstrated genuine artistic sensitivity combined with psychological penetration that made aesthetic existence appear intellectually respectable rather than merely frivolous. Judge William's defense of marriage as the foundation for ethical existence provided Kierkegaard with opportunities to explore his own ambivalence about domestic commitment while presenting the strongest possible arguments for conventional moral institutions. The judge's letters revealed understanding of aesthetic consciousness combined with commitment to transcending immediate pleasure through acceptance of universal moral obligations that provide framework for authentic personal development. The religious dimension that would become central to Kierkegaard's later work remained largely implicit in Either or, appearing primarily in suggestions that neither aesthetic nor ethical existence could provide complete human fulfillment. The work concluded with a sermon that pointed toward religious consciousness as a possible resolution to the contradictions inherent in purely aesthetic or ethical approaches to existence. Kierkegaard's literary technique in Either or established precedents for philosophical writing that combined analytical rigor with psychological penetration in ways that academic philosophy could not accommodate. His character portraits provided readers with access to lived consciousness rather than abstract argumentation, enabling forms of existential understanding that systematic philosophy could not achieve. The work demonstrated how literature could address philosophical questions without losing artistic sophistication. The psychological realism that characterizes both and Judge William reflected Kierkegaard's conviction that philosophical positions must be evaluated based on their existential implications rather than their logical consistency. Both characters were presented as intelligent individuals who had developed coherent worldviews that nevertheless failed to provide complete satisfaction. Their limitations were psychological rather than merely intellectual, requiring literary rather than purely logical analysis. The work's exploration of choice and commitment established themes that would remain central to existential philosophy throughout its subsequent development. Kierkegaard demonstrated how fundamental life choices involve commitments that cannot be justified through rational argument, but must be made despite uncertainty about their ultimate validity. The Either or of the title referred not to logical alternatives, but existential options that require decisive commitment without guarantee of success. The success of Either or established Kierkegaard's reputation as a philosophical writer who could address ultimate questions through literary techniques that made abstract ideas personally meaningful for readers. The work proved that philosophical literature could achieve both intellectual sophistication and popular accessibility without compromising its analytical rigor. Danish culture had produced its first major contribution to international philosophical discussion. The personal significance of either-or for Kierkegaard included its function as artistic transformation of his psychological struggles during the period following his broken engagement. Writing the work allowed him to explore his own ambivalence about commitment and responsibility while creating literary achievement that justified the personal sacrifices that serious intellectual work required. The aesthetic success of the work provided compensation for the ethical and social costs of his intellectual vocation. Either-or established Søren Kierkegaard as a philosophical writer who could combine existential urgency with literary artistry in ways that revolutionized how the modern world understood the relationship between thinking and living. The work demonstrated that authentic philosophy must address questions about how to exist rather than merely how to think, and that such questions required literary as well as logical forms of investigation. Chapter 6. Fear and Trembling. In October 1843, 8 months after the publication of Either-or, Danish readers encountered another pseudonymous work that would establish Søren Kierkegaard's international reputation as a revolutionary religious thinker. Fear and Trembling, published under the name Johannes de Silentio, presented an analysis of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac that challenged conventional Christian ethics while exploring the psychological dynamics of religious faith that transcends rational justification and social approval. The book's subtitle, A Dialectical Lyric, announced Kierkegaard's intention to combine rigorous philosophical analysis with poetic appreciation for the spiritual dimensions of human experience that systematic thinking could not adequately address. Johannes de Silentio approached Abraham's story not as historical narrative or moral exemplar, but as psychological case study that illuminated the essential character of religious consciousness in its most extreme manifestation. Abraham's situation represented what Kierkegaard termed the teleological suspension of the ethical circumstances, where religious commitment requires individuals to transcend universal moral principles in response to divine commands that cannot be justified through rational argument or social consensus. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac violated every ethical standard that made civilized society possible while expressing perfect obedience to God's command. The three problemata that structure the work's central argument explore different aspects of Abraham's situation that challenge conventional approaches to religious and ethical questions. Each problem examined how religious consciousness operates according to principles that transcend social morality, philosophical reasoning, and aesthetic appreciation. Religious existence, Kierkegaard suggested, involves forms of isolation and responsibility that make it the most demanding stage of human development. Johannes de Silentio's analysis of faith emphasized its paradoxical character as commitment that must be maintained despite the absence of rational guarantees about its validity. Faith involves believing, by virtue of the absurd, accepting religious truth that contradicts empirical evidence and logical reasoning. This approach to religious consciousness challenged both rationalist theology and conventional pietism by insisting that authentic faith requires acceptance of uncertainty. The work's exploration of Abraham's psychology provided readers with unprecedented analysis of religious experience from the perspective of the individual believer rather than institutional theology or philosophical system. Kierkegaard examined how Abraham maintained emotional commitment to God while facing the apparent contradiction between divine command and moral obligation. This psychological realism distinguished religious existentialism from traditional approaches to theological questions. The concept of the night of faith that Kierkegaard developed through his analysis of Abraham became one of his most influential contributions to religious thought. The night of faith lives simultaneously within secular society and beyond its moral limitations, maintaining ordinary social relationships while accepting responsibility for religious commitments that transcend conventional ethical standards. This psychological type embodied Kierkegaard's understanding of authentic religious existence. Kierkegaard's contrast between the night of faith and the night of infinite resignation illuminated different approaches to spiritual development that corresponded to aesthetic, ethical, and religious stages of existence. The night of resignation achieves spiritual nobility through acceptance of loss and renunciation, while the night of faith maintains hope for restoration of what has been sacrificed. Abraham exemplified faith rather than resignation because he maintained confidence that God would somehow restore Isaac. The work's literary technique combined philosophical argument with dramatic narrative in ways that made abstract theological concepts personally meaningful for readers who might never encounter similar extreme situations. Kierkegaard's retelling of Abraham's story enabled imaginative participation in religious consciousness while maintaining analytical precision about the psychological dynamics involved in authentic spiritual commitment. The Danish Church's response to fear and trembling revealed the work's challenge to conventional Christian culture that emphasized social conformity and institutional authority over individual spiritual struggle. Kierkegaard's analysis suggested that authentic Christianity might require forms of isolation and personal responsibility that made comfortable bourgeois religion impossible. The work implied criticism of Danish Lutheran culture that preferred ethical respectability to existential risk. The philosophical implications of Kierkegaard's analysis extended beyond specifically religious questions to fundamental problems about moral authority and individual responsibility in modern societies, where traditional sources of guidance no longer command universal respect. Abraham's situation provided extreme example of challenges that all individuals face when competing moral claims cannot be reconciled through rational argument or social consensus. The work's exploration of communication problems between religious consciousness and secular society established themes that would remain central to existential philosophy. Johannes de Silentio could analyze Abraham's situation with scholarly precision while acknowledging his inability to achieve the kind of faith that Abraham exemplified. This gap between understanding and existing illustrated Kierkegaard's conviction that religious truth must be lived rather than merely comprehended intellectually. The personal significance of fear and trembling for Kierkegaard included its function as indirect reflection on his own decision to break his engagement with Regina Olsen. Like Abraham, Kierkegaard had chosen to obey what he understood as divine command, despite its violation of conventional ethical standards. His treatment of Regina could be interpreted as cruel social behavior or necessary spiritual sacrifice, depending on whether one accepted religious categories for evaluating moral action. The psychological penetration that Kierkegaard brought to his analysis of Abraham's consciousness provided readers with unprecedented access to religious experience that philosophical theology typically reduced to abstract propositions. The work demonstrated how literary techniques could illuminate spiritual dimensions of human experience that systematic thinking could not adequately address. Religious consciousness required existential rather than merely intellectual analysis. The international influence of fear and trembling established Kierkegaard's reputation as a religious thinker who could address ultimate questions about faith and existence without retreating into conventional theological language or institutional church authority. The work provided conceptual framework for understanding religious consciousness that would influence subsequent development of existential philosophy, Protestant theology, and literary analysis of spiritual themes. Fear and Trembling demonstrated Søren Kierkegaard's mature philosophical method that combined existential urgency with analytical sophistication in ways that revolutionized how modern culture understood the psychology of religious faith. The work established faith as a psychological category that transcended rational justification while requiring passionate commitment that involved ultimate personal responsibility for choices that could not be validated through external authority. Chapter 7. The Concept of Anxiety. In June 1844, Søren Kierkegaard published under the pseudonym Vigilius Hofnensis what would become his most systematic exploration of human psychology and one of the foundational texts of existential philosophy. The concept of anxiety presented anxiety not as a pathological condition requiring medical treatment, but as the fundamental experience that reveals human freedom and the psychological dynamics through which individuals become authentic selves through their responses to possibility and necessity. Kierkegaard's analysis began with the observation that anxiety differs qualitatively from fear in that it has no specific object, but rather emerges from the individual's confrontation with freedom itself. While fear responds to particular threats that can be identified and potentially avoided, anxiety represents consciousness of the unlimited possibilities available to free beings who must choose their own existence without external guarantees about the consequences of their decisions. The work's subtitle, A Simple Psychologically Orienting Deliberation on the Dogmatic Issue of Hereditary Sin, indicated Kierkegaard's intention to reinterpret traditional Christian doctrine about original sin as psychological description of universal human experience rather than historical claim about supernatural events. Adam's fall represented the transition from innocence to self-consciousness that every individual must navigate in becoming responsible for their own moral and spiritual development. Vigilius Hofniensis presented anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the psychological state that emerges when individuals recognize their capacity to choose alternatives that will determine their future existence. This recognition involves simultaneous attraction and repulsion toward possibility, creating internal tension that can be resolved only through decisive action that commits the individual to particular forms of existence, while excluding others. Kierkegaard's psychological analysis distinguished between different types of anxiety that correspond to various stages of human development and spiritual awareness. Aesthetic anxiety emerges from recognition of temporal limitations and the impossibility of experiencing all possible pleasures. Ethical anxiety results from consciousness of moral responsibility and the potential for guilt. Religious anxiety involves confrontation with eternal significance of temporal choices. The concept of the leap that Kierkegaard developed in this work became central to his understanding of how individuals navigate transitions between different stages of existence. The leap represents decisive choice that cannot be justified through rational argument, but must be made based on passionate commitment that accepts responsibility for consequences that remain uncertain. Every significant life decision involves some form of leap beyond logical justification. Kierkegaard's analysis of innocence and its loss provided sophisticated account of psychological development that combined biblical narrative with empirical observation of how children become self-conscious moral agents. Innocence involves immediate relationship to existence that is lost when reflection introduces awareness of possibilities and responsibilities that require conscious choice. This loss is simultaneously necessary for human development and tragic in its destruction of natural spontaneity. The work's exploration of temporal consciousness illuminated how anxiety emerges from human beings' unique position as creatures who exist simultaneously in time and eternity. Unlike animals that live entirely in the present moment, humans experience anxiety because they are conscious of future possibilities that may or may not be realized and past decisions that cannot be changed. This temporal structure of consciousness creates existential conditions that generate anxiety as an unavoidable feature of human experience. Kierkegaard's psychological realism in describing anxiety states provided readers with analytical framework for understanding their own emotional experience in ways that neither medical pathology nor moral judgment could adequately address. Anxiety was presented not as personal failure or mental illness, but as evidence of spiritual capacity for growth through conscious acceptance of freedom and responsibility. The work's analysis of sin and guilt extended traditional theological concepts into psychological territory that made them relevant for secular readers who might not accept institutional Christian authority. Sin was interpreted as the individual's attempt to escape the anxiety of freedom through forms of self-deception that deny personal responsibility for life choices. Guilt represents consciousness of this self-betrayal rather than violation of external moral codes. Kierkegaard's discussion of sexual difference and its psychological implications provided complex account of how gender affects individual responses to anxiety and freedom. Women were presented as more immediately related to existence through their reproductive capacity, while men were described as more inclined toward abstract reflection that can become escape from existential commitment. These gender analyses reflected 19th century cultural assumptions while offering insights into sexual psychology that remained influential. The pedagogical implications of Kierkegaard's anxiety analysis suggested approaches to human development that could nurture authentic selfhood while respecting individual freedom to choose their own existence. Education should create conditions that enable individuals to recognize and accept their freedom rather than providing systematic answers that eliminate the anxiety essential for spiritual growth. This approach challenged conventional educational methods that emphasized external authority over internal development. The work's literary technique combined philosophical argumentation with psychological description in ways that made abstract concepts accessible through concrete analysis of recognizable emotional states. Readers could identify their own experiences in Kierkegaard's descriptions while gaining conceptual vocabulary for understanding psychological dynamics that might otherwise remain unconscious or unexamined. The scientific pretensions of Hegelian systematic philosophy were challenged by Kierkegaard's insistence that anxiety cannot be eliminated through rational understanding, but must be accepted as permanent feature of free existence. Philosophical systems that promised complete knowledge were revealed as forms of intellectual escape from the existential conditions that make human life both meaningful and difficult. The religious dimensions of Kierkegaard's anxiety analysis prepared readers for his later exploration of specifically Christian consciousness while maintaining psychological accuracy that made his insights relevant for secular audiences. Anxiety was presented as natural preparation for religious awareness rather than pathological condition requiring supernatural intervention. Faith represents one possible response to anxiety rather than its elimination. The concept of anxiety established Søren Kierkegaard as a psychological thinker who could illuminate universal features of human consciousness while maintaining respect for individual uniqueness and freedom. The work provided conceptual foundation for existential philosophy that would influence subsequent development of psychology, theology, and literary analysis of modern alienation and spiritual searching. Chapter 8: Stages on Life's Way. In April 1845, Søren Kierkegaard published his most comprehensive exploration of human development and the psychological transitions through which individuals move toward authentic selfhood. Stages on Life's Way, written under multiple pseudonyms, presented a more complex and nuanced analysis of aesthetic, ethical, and religious existence than his earlier works, while introducing the category of repetition as essential for understanding how individuals achieve continuity of identity despite constant change. The work structure as a symposium enabled Kierkegaard to present competing perspectives on love and marriage through characters who represented different approaches to intimate relationships. The aesthetic stage was explored through discussions of romantic seduction and erotic pleasure that revealed both the appeal and the limitations of existence devoted to immediate satisfaction. The ethical stage received detailed treatment through analysis of marriage as social institution that provides framework for moral development. The young man's story of his relationship with an unnamed young woman provided Kierkegaard with opportunities to explore the psychological dynamics of romantic idealization and its inevitable failure when fantasy encounters actual human complexity. The young man's love was revealed as essentially narcissistic projection rather than genuine appreciation for another person's independent reality. His suffering resulted from collision between aesthetic expectations and ethical demands of actual relationship. The married man's defense of bourgeois domesticity presented the strongest possible arguments for conventional family life, while acknowledging its limitations for individuals whose spiritual development requires forms of solitude and independence that married life makes difficult to maintain. Marriage provides stability and moral framework for personal growth, but it cannot address ultimate questions about meaning and purpose that transcend social relationships. The category of repetition that Kierkegaard introduced through the character of Constantin Constantius provided alternative to both aesthetic novelty-seeking and ethical routine. Repetition involves conscious reclamation of past experiences through present commitment that transforms memory into lived reality. This psychological mechanism enables individuals to achieve authentic selfhood through integration of temporal experience rather than escape from time's limitations. The religious stage of existence received its most detailed treatment in Frater Taciturnus's analysis of the guilty, not guilty narrative. Religious consciousness emerges when individuals recognize that neither aesthetic pleasure nor ethical duty can provide adequate foundation for authentic existence. Religious stage involves acceptance of guilt and forgiveness that transcends rational justification while enabling forms of spiritual development impossible within purely secular frameworks. The work's exploration of communication problems between different stages of existence illuminated Kierkegaard's developing understanding of indirect communication as necessary method for addressing existential questions. Individuals operating within different existential frameworks literally cannot understand each other because their fundamental categories for interpreting experience are incompatible. This insight would prove central to Kierkegaard's mature philosophical method. Kierkegaard's analysis of sexual psychology provided sophisticated account of how erotic desire functions within different existential stages while maintaining different relationships to temporal and eternal dimensions of human experience. Aesthetic sexuality seeks immediate pleasure that eliminates anxiety through sensual absorption. Ethical sexuality accepts responsibility for consequences while maintaining commitment to particular individuals. Religious sexuality transcends both immediate pleasure and social obligation through spiritual transformation. The literary technique that Kierkegaard developed for Stages on Life's Way enabled him to explore psychological positions that he understood empathetically without endorsing personally. Each pseudonymous author presented coherent worldview that revealed both insights and limitations that could not be adequately addressed through direct argumentation. This indirect approach allowed readers to discover existential truths through imaginative participation rather than logical compulsion. The work Psychological Realism provided readers with analytical framework for understanding their own emotional development while avoiding the systematic completeness that would transform existential insights into academic philosophy. Kierkegaard presented human development as ongoing process, requiring constant choice and commitment rather than progression toward final resolution that would eliminate existential anxiety. The Danish cultural context that provided immediate background for Stages on Life's Way included bourgeois society's increasing emphasis on romantic love and domestic happiness as primary sources of life meaning. Kierkegaard's analysis revealed both the appeal and the inadequacy of these cultural ideals, while suggesting that authentic existence requires forms of spiritual development that transcend social conventions about personal fulfillment. The work's exploration of memory and temporal consciousness provided sophisticated account of how individuals achieve psychological integration despite constant change in their circumstances and relationships. Repetition enables conscious appropriation of past experience that transforms temporal sequence into meaningful narrative. This psychological mechanism is essential for authentic selfhood because it enables individuals to take responsibility for their entire life history rather than identifying with momentary states. The educational implications of Kierkegaard's stage analysis suggested that human development cannot be accelerated through external instruction, but requires individual discovery of existential truths that must be appropriated personally rather than learned academically. This approach challenged conventional educational methods while providing conceptual foundation for pedagogical approaches that respect individual freedom and developmental timing. The religious psychology that Kierkegaard developed through his analysis of guilt and forgiveness provided alternative to both rational theology and conventional pietism. Religious consciousness involves acceptance of personal responsibility for existential choices combined with trust in divine grace that transcends human understanding. This psychological realism made religious categories relevant for individuals who could not accept institutional church authority. The philosophical implications of Stages on Life's Way extended beyond individual psychology to questions about social organization and cultural development. Kierkegaard's analysis suggested that modern society's emphasis on rational planning and systematic organization might be incompatible with forms of authentic human development that require individual freedom to make existential choices without external guarantee of their validity. Stages on Life's Way established Søren Kierkegaard as a philosopher of human development who could illuminate universal patterns in psychological growth while maintaining respect for individual uniqueness and freedom. The work provided conceptual vocabulary for understanding existential transitions that would influence subsequent development of psychology, sociology, and literary analysis of modern consciousness and spiritual development. Chapter 9. Concluding Unscientific Postscript. In February 1846, Søren Kierkegaard published what would become his most comprehensive and influential philosophical work, a massive tome that presented itself modestly as a postscript to his earlier philosophical fragments, but actually constituted a revolutionary critique of systematic philosophy and a complete alternative approach to ultimate questions about existence, truth, and human meaning. Concluding Unscientific Postscript, written under the pseudonym Johannes Climacus, would establish Kierkegaard's reputation as the founder of existential philosophy. The work's central argument challenged the fundamental assumptions of Hegelian systematic philosophy that dominated European intellectual life, during the mid-19th century. Hegel had claimed that philosophical thinking could achieve complete objective knowledge of reality through dialectical reasoning that reconciled all contradictions within comprehensive systematic understanding. Kierkegaard's Johannes Climacus argued that this approach was fundamentally misconceived because it ignored the existential situation of the thinking individual. The concept of subjective truth that Kierkegaard developed as alternative to objective systematic knowledge represented one of his most radical philosophical innovations. Subjective truth is not mere personal opinion or arbitrary preference, but rather the kind of understanding that emerges when individuals accept passionate responsibility for their existence without external guarantees about the correctness of their choices. This form of truth cannot be communicated through logical demonstration, but must be appropriated through personal commitment. Kierkegaard's famous formula that truth is subjectivity did not deny the existence of objective facts about the empirical world, but rather insisted that ultimate questions about meaning, value, and purpose cannot be resolved through scientific or philosophical methods that eliminate the passionate interest of existing individuals. Questions about how to live require answers that engage the whole person, rather than merely satisfying intellectual curiosity. The work's analysis of the relationship between thinking and existing revealed fundamental problems with philosophical approaches that attempt to understand human consciousness from an eternal perspective that abstracts from temporal circumstances and practical commitments. Existing individuals cannot achieve the kind of detached objectivity that systematic philosophy requires because they are constantly involved in making choices that commit them to particular forms of life. Johannes Climacus's exploration of the leap of faith provided detailed psychological analysis of religious commitment that transcends rational justification while maintaining intellectual honesty about the uncertainty involved in ultimate questions. Faith involves passionate commitment to possibilities that cannot be verified through empirical investigation or logical demonstration. This commitment requires courage rather than knowledge, passion rather than proof. The work's critique of the crowd and defense of the single individual established themes that would become central to existential philosophy and modern psychology. Kierkegaard argued that authentic existence requires individuals to take personal responsibility for their choices rather than conforming to social expectations or accepting authority of majority opinion. Truth and authenticity are necessarily individual rather than collective achievements. Kierkegaard's analysis of irony and humor as forms of existential consciousness provided sophisticated account of how individuals maintain psychological distance from immediate circumstances while remaining engaged with practical life. Irony represents aesthetic consciousness that recognizes gap between ideal and actual. Humor emerges from ethical consciousness that accepts human limitation. Religious consciousness transcends both through acceptance of paradox. The work's exploration of communication problems illuminated Kierkegaard's understanding of why ultimate questions cannot be addressed through direct statement, but require indirect methods that engage readers' existential rather than merely intellectual interest. Systematic presentation of religious truth actually prevents the kind of personal appropriation that authentic religious consciousness requires. The pedagogical implications of Kierkegaard's approach challenge conventional educational methods that emphasize transmission of objective knowledge rather than cultivation of individual capacity for existential choice and commitment. Authentic education must help individuals recognize their freedom and responsibility rather than providing systematic answers that eliminate the uncertainty essential for personal development. Kierkegaard's psychological analysis of different approaches to religious consciousness revealed the inadequacy of both rational theology and emotional pietism for addressing ultimate questions about human destiny and divine relation. Rational theology eliminates the passionate interest that makes religious questions meaningful, while emotional pietism avoids intellectual honesty about uncertainty and paradox involved in religious commitment. The work's literary technique combined philosophical argumentation with psychological analysis and personal confession in ways that demonstrated how abstract ideas must be appropriated through concrete individual experience. Johannes Climacus presented himself as someone who understood religious consciousness intellectually while acknowledging his inability to achieve the kind of faith that such understanding revealed as necessary. The Danish cultural context that provided background for concluding unscientific postscript included increasing influence of German idealist philosophy and rationalist theology that threatened to transform Christianity into intellectual system rather than existential commitment. Kierkegaard's critique aimed to restore religious consciousness to its proper status as passionate personal relationship rather than academic subject matter. The work's analysis of modern alienation anticipated themes that would become central to 20th century philosophy and psychology. Kierkegaard identified systematic thinking and social conformity as primary sources of estrangement from authentic existence. Modern individuals were losing capacity for passionate commitment while gaining sophisticated intellectual tools that could analyze, but not resolve ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. The international influence of concluding unscientific postscript established Kierkegaard's reputation as philosopher who could address ultimate questions without retreating into academic abstractions or institutional authority. The work provided conceptual foundation for existential philosophy that would influence subsequent development of psychology, theology, literary criticism, and social analysis. The personal significance of the postscript for Kierkegaard included its function as comprehensive statement of philosophical position that he had been developing throughout his authorship. Writing the work enabled him to achieve systematic presentation of anti-systematic philosophy that justified his rejection of conventional academic career while establishing his intellectual credentials for serious philosophical discussion. Concluding unscientific postscript demonstrated Søren Kierkegaard's mature philosophical method that combined existential urgency with analytical sophistication in ways that revolutionized how modern culture understood the relationship between thinking and living, objective knowledge and subjective truth, systematic philosophy and authentic existence. Chapter 10. Attack on Christendom. In 1854, at the age of 41, Søren Kierkegaard launched what would become his most controversial and personally costly intellectual campaign, a systematic attack on Danish Lutheran culture that he believed had transformed authentic Christianity into comfortable bourgeois respectability. The campaign began with newspaper articles criticizing Bishop Jacob Peter Münster, continued with pamphlets that challenged the entire structure of institutional Christianity, and culminated in Kierkegaard's complete alienation from Danish society during the final year of his life. The immediate catalyst for Kierkegaard's public campaign was the death of Bishop Münster in January 1854 and the eulogy delivered by Hans Lassen Martensen, Kierkegaard's former professor, who praised Münster as a witness to the truth. This characterization infuriated Kierkegaard because he had spent years observing how Münster's ecclesiastical career embodied exactly the kind of worldly accommodation that genuine Christianity should oppose. The bishop had achieved social success and political influence by making Christian truth palatable to bourgeois sensibilities. Kierkegaard's first public article was Bishop Münster, a witness to the truth, appeared in Fædrelandet newspaper and marked his transition from pseudonymous aesthetic authorship to direct religious polemic. The article argued that Münster's comfortable integration into Danish social and political establishment demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of Christianity, which requires individuals to accept social isolation and worldly disadvantage as consequences of authentic religious commitment. The theological argument underlying Kierkegaard's attack focused on the difference between Christendom and Christianity, between institutional religion that serves social and political functions and authentic religious consciousness that transforms individual existence through acceptance of divine demands that conflict with worldly success. Christendom represents Christianity's accommodation to fallen human nature, while true Christianity maintains its radical challenge to conventional values and social arrangements. Kierkegaard's pamphlets, published under the title The Moment, provided sustained analysis of how institutional Christianity betrays its own essential message by making religious truth comfortable for individuals who want spiritual benefits without existential costs. Danish Lutheran culture had transformed the New Testament's radical message about self-denial and social alienation into middle-class values that supported rather than challenged bourgeois lifestyle and political arrangements. The psychological motivation for Kierkegaard's campaign included his recognition that his intellectual career had reached a point where continued aesthetic and philosophical work would represent escape from the religious commitment that his own analysis had revealed as necessary for authentic existence. The attack on Christendom became Kierkegaard's attempt to live the religious truth he had been analyzing rather than merely understanding it academically. The social consequences of Kierkegaard's public campaign were immediate and devastating. Copenhagen society, which had previously regarded him as an eccentric but harmless intellectual, now perceived him as a dangerous critic of institutions that provided social stability and cultural identity. His attacks on the church were interpreted as attacks on Danish national values and social order, creating forms of isolation that exceeded anything he had previously experienced. Kierkegaard's analysis of clergy as a social class revealed how professional religious leadership corrupts authentic Christianity by creating economic incentives for accommodating religious truth to social expectations. Pastors who depend on church salaries cannot afford to preach messages that alienate congregations or challenge political authorities. This economic dependency transforms spiritual leaders into social functionaries rather than witnesses to religious truth. The campaign's exploration of liturgical and sacramental practices demonstrated how institutional Christianity transforms direct religious experience into ceremonial routines that provide aesthetic satisfaction while avoiding existential challenge. Baptism, confirmation, marriage, and burial become social rituals that mark conventional life transitions rather than occasions for genuine spiritual transformation. Kierkegaard's critique of theological education revealed how academic study of Christianity actually prevents the kind of passionate personal appropriation that authentic religious consciousness requires. Seminary training produces scholars who can analyze religious texts and doctrinal systems, but cannot achieve the kind of faith that such analysis reveals is necessary. Academic theology becomes a sophisticated form of irreligion. The pamphlet's analysis of congregational life showed how church attendance functions as social activity that provides sense of community and moral respectability, while eliminating the isolation and personal responsibility that New Testament Christianity demands. Worship services become aesthetic and social experiences rather than encounters with divine authority that challenges conventional values and comfortable assumptions. Kierkegaard's exploration of martyrdom and persecution as essential features of authentic Christianity challenged Danish Lutheran culture's assumption that religious and social harmony indicated healthy relationship between church and society. True Christianity necessarily creates conflict with worldly authorities, because divine demands contradict fallen human nature's preference for comfort and social acceptance. The psychological cost of maintaining his public campaign while facing increasing social isolation began affecting Kierkegaard's health and emotional well-being during 1855. The stress of living according to religious principles that eliminated conventional sources of comfort and meaning contributed to physical deterioration that would culminate in his collapse and death in October. The intellectual legacy of Kierkegaard's attack on Christendom extended beyond immediate Danish context to fundamental questions about the relationship between religious institutions and authentic spiritual life that would influence subsequent development of theology, sociology of religion, and analysis of modern secularization. His critique anticipated problems that would affect all forms of institutional Christianity in modern societies. The campaign's failure to produce significant reform in Danish Lutheran culture confirmed Kierkegaard's analysis of how institutional religion resists prophetic criticism by marginalizing individuals who challenge its accommodation to worldly values. The Church's response to his attacks demonstrated exactly the kind of social and political calculation that he identified as evidence of its corruption. The personal significance of the campaign for Kierkegaard included its function as existential test of whether he possessed the kind of religious courage that his philosophical analysis had revealed as necessary for authentic Christianity. The attack on Christendom became his attempt to discover whether he could live according to religious truth, rather than merely understanding it intellectually. Kierkegaard's final writings during 1855 revealed increasing recognition that authentic Christianity might be impossible within existing social and cultural arrangements that require individuals to maintain conventional relationships and practical commitments. Religious truth might demand forms of social alienation that make ordinary human life impossible, while providing the only foundation for genuine spiritual development. The attack on Christendom demonstrated Søren Kierkegaard's ultimate commitment to religious truth over social acceptance, intellectual respectability, or personal comfort. The campaign represented his final attempt to close the gap between thinking and existing that had motivated his entire philosophical career, while establishing his legacy as religious thinker who accepted the practical consequences of ideas he believed were true. Chapter 11, The Sickness unto Death. In July 1849, Søren Kierkegaard published under the pseudonym Anticlimacus what many consider his most penetrating analysis of human consciousness and the fundamental spiritual condition of modern existence. The Sickness unto Death presented despair not as temporary emotional disturbance, but as the basic existential situation of human beings who must achieve authentic selfhood through conscious acceptance of their relationship to eternal values that transcend temporal circumstances and social expectations. The work's opening definition of despair as the sickness unto death drew on the Gospel of John's account of Lazarus to suggest that spiritual death is more serious than physical mortality because it involves the self's rejection of its own possibility for authentic existence. Unlike physical death, which ends temporal experience, spiritual death perpetuates itself through forms of self-deception that prevent individuals from recognizing their actual condition while eliminating possibilities for genuine healing. Kierkegaard's analysis of the self as a relation that relates itself to itself, and in relating itself to itself relates itself to the power that constituted it, provided systematic account of human consciousness that combined philosophical sophistication with psychological realism. The self is not a simple substance or collection of properties, but rather an ongoing process of self-creation that requires conscious acceptance of responsibility for one's existence. The work's exploration of different forms of despair revealed how individuals attempt to escape the anxiety of freedom through various strategies of self-deception that actually intensify the spiritual condition they are designed to eliminate. The despair of infinitude involves losing oneself in abstract possibilities without accepting finite limitations. The despair of finitude involves accepting limitations while rejecting transcendent possibilities that give life ultimate meaning. Anticlimacus's analysis of the despair of not willing to be oneself illuminated how individuals reject their actual existence in favor of fantasized alternatives that eliminate the responsibility and uncertainty inherent in authentic selfhood. This form of despair is particularly characteristic of aesthetic consciousness that seeks immediate satisfaction while avoiding commitment to possibilities that require sustained effort and acceptance of limitation. The complementary analysis of the despair of willing to be oneself revealed how individuals attempt to create themselves through purely autonomous will that rejects dependence on transcendent sources of meaning and value. This form of despair characterizes ethical consciousness that accepts moral responsibility while rejecting religious categories that would place human autonomy within larger spiritual context. Kierkegaard's exploration of sin as intensified despair provided theological interpretation of psychological conditions that could also be analyzed in purely secular terms. Sin involves conscious rejection of one's proper relationship to eternal values combined with defiant assertion of autonomous selfhood. This analysis made traditional Christian doctrine relevant for individuals who might not accept institutional religious authority while maintaining theological precision about ultimate spiritual realities. The work's discussion of faith as the opposite of despair presented religious consciousness as passionate acceptance of one's existence before God, rather than intellectual belief in particular propositions about supernatural events. Faith involves willing to be the self that one actually is, including acceptance of dependence on divine grace for possibilities that cannot be achieved through autonomous human effort. The psychological realism that characterized Kierkegaard's analysis of despair made his insights relevant for readers who could recognize described emotional states in their own experience while gaining conceptual vocabulary for understanding spiritual dimensions of psychological problems. The work demonstrated how theological categories could illuminate universal features of human consciousness without requiring acceptance of institutional religious authority. Anticlimacus's exploration of consciousness and self-awareness provided sophisticated account of how despair intensifies as individuals become more conscious of their actual spiritual condition. Increased self-knowledge does not automatically produce spiritual health, but can actually intensify despair by making self-deception more difficult while not providing resources for authentic spiritual transformation. The work's analysis of temporal consciousness and its relationship to eternal concerns revealed how despair emerges from human beings' unique position as creatures who exist simultaneously within time and beyond temporal limitations. Individuals experience despair because they are conscious of possibilities that transcend their immediate circumstances, while remaining bound to finite conditions that prevent complete realization of spiritual aspirations. Kierkegaard's discussion of social conformity as sophisticated form of despair anticipated themes that would become central to 20th century analysis of modern alienation and mass society. Most individuals avoid confronting their spiritual condition by adopting conventional social roles that provide external validation while eliminating need for personal spiritual development. This conformity represents refined form of self-rejection. The work's literary technique combined systematic philosophical analysis with concrete psychological description in ways that made abstract theological concepts personally meaningful for readers. Anticlimacus presented himself as Christian thinker who understood despair and faith from personal experience rather than merely academic study, providing model for how religious truth must be appropriated existentially rather than intellectually. The pedagogical implications of Kierkegaard's despair analysis suggested that authentic education must help individuals recognize their actual spiritual condition rather than providing solutions that eliminate the anxiety essential for genuine personal development. Spiritual growth requires acceptance of despair as preparatory condition for faith rather than pathological state requiring immediate cure. The Danish cultural context that provided background for the sickness unto death included increasing secularization and rationalization that were eliminating traditional sources of spiritual meaning while providing material prosperity and social stability. Kierkegaard's analysis revealed how these cultural developments could actually intensify forms of despair by making spiritual concerns seem irrelevant while providing no adequate substitute for religious categories. The work's influence on subsequent development of psychology, theology, and philosophy established Kierkegaard's reputation as thinker who could address ultimate questions about human consciousness and spiritual development with analytical precision that made religious categories relevant for secular intellectual culture. The analysis provided conceptual foundation for existential psychology and theological anthropology. The personal significance of the sickness unto death for Kierkegaard included its function as his most systematic statement about the spiritual condition that his entire authorship had been designed to address. The work represented culmination of his psychological and theological investigations while preparing for his final period of direct religious communication through the attack on Christendom. The sickness unto death established Søren Kierkegaard as analyst of human consciousness who could illuminate universal spiritual conditions while maintaining respect for individual uniqueness and freedom. The work demonstrated how theological insights could address psychological questions that secular approaches could not adequately resolve while providing conceptual vocabulary for understanding modern alienation and spiritual searching. Chapter 12: Training in Christianity. In September 1850, Søren Kierkegaard published his final systematic exploration of religious consciousness and the practical requirements for authentic Christian existence in modern society. Training in Christianity, written under the pseudonym Anticlimacus, but acknowledged by Kierkegaard as expressing his own religious position, presented the most demanding and uncompromising account of what it means to follow Christ that had appeared in Protestant literature since the earliest church fathers. The work's central thesis challenged the entire history of institutional Christianity by arguing that authentic discipleship requires individuals to encounter Christ as their contemporary rather than accepting him as safely historical figure whose radical demands can be accommodated to conventional social and moral expectations. Training in Christianity insisted that genuine religious commitment involves accepting the scandal and suffering that inevitably result from attempting to live according to New Testament values in societies organized around fundamentally different principles. Anticlimacus's analysis of the offense that Christ necessarily represents for human reason and social convention provided systematic account of why authentic Christianity remains permanently revolutionary rather than becoming culturally respectable through historical development. Christ's demand that individuals choose between worldly success and spiritual authenticity creates offense, because it challenges fundamental assumptions about human happiness and social organization that cannot be reconciled with religious truth. The work's exploration of the invitation that Christ extends to all who labor and are heavy laden revealed the universal appeal of Christianity while maintaining emphasis on the demanding character of authentic religious commitment. Christ offers rest from spiritual anxiety and social alienation, but this rest requires acceptance of worldly disadvantage and social isolation that most individuals find unacceptable when they understand its practical implications. Kierkegaard's discussion of imitation as essential element of Christian discipleship challenged Protestant emphasis on justification by faith alone that had eliminated practical requirements for following Christ's example of social isolation and worldly renunciation. Authentic Christianity requires not merely believing particular propositions about Christ's divinity, but actually attempting to live according to his example despite social and economic costs. The work's analysis of suffering as inevitable consequence of Christian existence in fallen world provided detailed account of how authentic religious commitment necessarily creates conflict with social institutions, family relationships, and professional obligations that presuppose values incompatible with New Testament teaching. Christian suffering is not accidental misfortune, but necessary result of attempting to live according to divine, rather than human standards. Anticlimacus's critique of Christendom as historical betrayal of authentic Christianity anticipated Kierkegaard's final campaign against Danish Lutheran culture by demonstrating how institutional religion transforms radical religious truth into comfortable social convention. Christendom represents Christianity's accommodation to fallen human nature rather than its transformation through divine grace. The work's psychological analysis of how individuals avoid authentic Christian commitment revealed sophisticated understanding of self-deception mechanisms that enable people to maintain religious identity while avoiding practical consequences of religious truth. Most individuals who consider themselves Christians actually practice forms of aesthetic or ethical existence that eliminate religious categories from practical decision-making. Kierkegaard's exploration of the moment of religious decision illuminated temporal structure of authentic religious consciousness that transcends both aesthetic immediacy and ethical universality through passionate commitment to eternal truth that must be appropriated personally rather than accepted socially. Religious decision creates new temporal reality rather than merely choosing between pre-existing alternatives. The work's discussion of religious communication revealed why authentic Christianity cannot be transmitted through logical argument or historical evidence, but requires forms of indirect communication that engage individuals' existential rather than merely intellectual interest. Direct presentation of religious truth actually prevents the kind of personal appropriation that authentic religious consciousness requires. The literary technique that Kierkegaard employed in training in Christianity combined systematic theological analysis with passionate personal testimony in ways that demonstrated how religious truth must be lived rather than merely understood academically. Anticlimacus presented himself as someone striving toward authentic Christianity rather than claiming to have achieved perfect religious consciousness. The work's analysis of martyrdom and persecution as normal, rather than exceptional features of Christian existence, challenged modern Christianity's assumption that religious and social harmony indicates healthy relationship between church and society. Authentic Christianity necessarily creates conflict with worldly authorities, because divine demands contradict fallen human nature's preference for comfort and social acceptance. The Danish cultural context that provided background for training in Christianity included comfortable bourgeois Christianity that emphasized moral respectability and social harmony, while eliminating transcendent dimensions that made religious commitment psychologically demanding. Kierkegaard's analysis revealed how this cultural development represented fundamental misunderstanding of Christian truth. The work's influence on subsequent development of theology and religious philosophy established Kierkegaard's reputation as thinker who could restore religious consciousness to its proper status as existential commitment rather than intellectual belief or social convention. The analysis provided conceptual foundation for theological movements that emphasize practical rather than merely theoretical dimensions of religious truth. The personal significance of training in Christianity for Kierkegaard included its function as preparation for his final period of direct religious communication through public campaign against institutional Christianity. Writing the work enabled him to achieve systematic statement of religious position that justified his rejection of conventional church participation while establishing intellectual credentials for serious theological discussion. The work's exploration of religious loneliness and social isolation provided penetrating analysis of psychological costs involved in authentic spiritual commitment, while suggesting that such costs are necessary for genuine religious development. Christian existence requires forms of separation from conventional social life that most individuals find unacceptable despite their attraction to religious ideals. The educational implications of Kierkegaard's analysis suggested that authentic religious development cannot be achieved through institutional instruction, but requires individual discovery of spiritual truth through personal encounter with divine authority that transcends human teaching. Religious education should create conditions for individual spiritual development rather than transmitting systematic doctrinal knowledge. Training in Christianity established Søren Kierkegaard as religious thinker who could present Christian truth in ways that restored its radical character while maintaining intellectual sophistication that made religious categories relevant for modern secular culture. The work demonstrated how authentic Christianity requires existential transformation rather than merely intellectual assent or moral improvement. Chapter 13, Solitary Wanderer. By 1853, Søren Kierkegaard had become Copenhagen's most recognizable and isolated figure, a man whose daily walks through the city's streets provided him with the physical exercise and social observation that sustained both his health and his literary work, while emphasizing his complete alienation from conventional Danish society. His morning and afternoon perambulations took him through neighborhoods where he could observe the bourgeois life he had rejected while maintaining the psychological distance necessary for philosophical analysis of modern existence. Kierkegaard's walking routine was as methodical as his writing schedule, involving carefully planned routes that enabled him to encounter different social classes and observe various forms of human behavior without becoming entangled in the social obligations that normal participation in community life would require. He had perfected the art of being simultaneously present and absent in social situations, engaging strangers in brief conversations while maintaining fundamental isolation from their concerns and commitments. The streets of Copenhagen provided Kierkegaard with a living laboratory for studying the psychological dynamics he explored in his philosophical works. Observing how individuals navigated social roles, romantic relationships, and professional obligations enabled him to test theoretical insights against empirical evidence, while developing increasingly sophisticated understanding of how most people avoid confronting existential questions that his own life had made unavoidable. Kierkegaard's reputation as an eccentric intellectual celebrity created social dynamics that confirmed his analysis of how modern society deals with individuals who challenge conventional values and expectations. People recognized him on the streets and often stared or pointed, making him an object of curiosity while reinforcing his sense that authentic existence necessarily involves forms of isolation that prevent normal social integration. The financial independence that his inheritance provided allowed Kierkegaard to maintain his solitary lifestyle without facing economic pressures that might have forced him into conventional employment or social relationships. He could afford to purchase books, attend cultural events, and maintain comfortable living arrangements while pursuing intellectual work that offered no prospects for practical success or social recognition. His interactions with Copenhagen's working classes during his daily walks provided Kierkegaard with insights into forms of human authenticity that educated bourgeois culture seemed to eliminate through sophistication and social ambition. He often engaged coachmen, servants, and laborers in conversations that revealed psychological honesty and existential awareness that contrasted favorably with the elaborate self-deceptions he observed among educated professionals. Kierkegaard's relationship with Copenhagen's intellectual and cultural elite became increasingly strained as his philosophical positions developed in directions that challenged assumptions shared by most educated Danes. Former friends and academic colleagues found his religious intensity and social criticism unsettling, while his rejection of conventional career advancement seemed to confirm their suspicions about his psychological stability. The daily routine that structured Kierkegaard's solitary existence reflected his conviction that authentic intellectual work requires forms of discipline and isolation that conventional social life makes impossible. His mornings were devoted to writing, his afternoons to walking and social observation, his evenings to reading and reflection. This schedule eliminated spontaneous social interaction while providing optimal conditions for sustained philosophical investigation. Kierkegaard's observations of family life during his walks through residential neighborhoods provided him with continuing education in the domestic dynamics he had rejected through his broken engagement with Regina Olsen. He could observe married couples, parents with children, and extended family gatherings, while maintaining the psychological distance necessary for analyzing social institutions that he could understand but not participate in personally. The increasing frequency of hostile encounters during his public appearances reflected Copenhagen society's growing irritation with his criticism of institutional Christianity and conventional morality. What had initially been tolerance for eccentric behavior gradually transformed into active hostility as Kierkegaard's published works made clear his fundamental rejection of values that most Danes considered essential for social stability and cultural identity. Kierkegaard's solitary meals at Copenhagen's restaurants and cafes provided opportunities for observing social interaction while maintaining personal isolation. He developed skills for eating alone without appearing pathetic or antisocial, transforming necessary biological functions into occasions for philosophical reflection on the relationship between individual authenticity and social conformity. His correspondence during this period revealed growing recognition that his chosen lifestyle involved psychological costs that no amount of intellectual achievement could completely compensate. Letters to friends and family members expressed loneliness and melancholy while maintaining commitment to forms of existence that made conventional relationships impossible. The physical toll of maintaining complete intellectual independence while facing increasing social hostility began affecting Kierkegaard's health during his final years. The stress of living according to principles that eliminated conventional sources of comfort and meaning contributed to symptoms of depression and anxiety that walking and intellectual work could no longer adequately address. Kierkegaard's growing identification with religious figures who had accepted social isolation and persecution as consequences of spiritual commitment provided psychological framework for understanding his own situation in larger spiritual context. He increasingly saw his isolation not as personal failure, but as necessary consequence of authentic religious existence in societies organized around fundamentally secular values. The transformation of his public reputation from eccentric intellectual to dangerous social critic reflected broader cultural changes in Danish society that were eliminating traditional tolerance for individual nonconformity while demanding increasing social integration and ideological consensus. Kierkegaard's isolation became emblematic of broader conflicts between individual authenticity and social conformity that would characterize modern democratic societies. His final writings during 1854 to 1855 revealed increasing recognition that authentic existence might require forms of social alienation that make ordinary human life impossible while providing the only foundation for genuine spiritual development. The choice between social integration and existential authenticity might be absolute rather than subject to compromise through clever psychological or philosophical strategies. Kierkegaard's daily encounters with Copenhagen's church buildings during his walks provided constant reminders of the institutional Christianity that he had identified as primary obstacle to authentic religious consciousness. The elaborate architecture and comfortable congregations represented everything he found problematic about organized religion's accommodation to worldly values and social expectations. The notebooks that Kierkegaard maintained during his solitary years documented psychological and spiritual development that occurred outside conventional social frameworks while providing materials that would eventually inform his final campaign against institutional Christianity. Walking and writing had become integrated practices for exploring ultimate questions about human existence and spiritual authenticity. Søren Kierkegaard's life as solitary wanderer demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of attempting to live according to ultimate truth in societies that require practical compromises for normal participation. His isolation provided optimal conditions for philosophical investigation while eliminating forms of human connection that might have enriched both his personal experience and his intellectual understanding of authentic community. Chapter 14. The Final Collapse. October 2, 1855, began like countless other autumn days in Søren Kierkegaard's carefully regulated existence: morning writing, afternoon walking, evening reading and reflection. But his body, weakened by years of irregular eating, chronic stress, and the psychological exhaustion that accompanied complete social isolation, finally surrendered to pressures that 42 years of anxious intellectual labor had accumulated. Walking along Storgade near the cathedral where his father had once taken him to contemplate sin and salvation, Kierkegaard stumbled and fell, unable to continue the physical perambulation that had sustained both his health and his sanity. The passers-by who gathered around the collapsed figure saw only an oddly dressed middle-aged man who appeared to be suffering from some combination of physical illness and mental disturbance. They could not know they were witnessing the final chapter of an intellectual career that had revolutionized how the modern world understood anxiety, despair, and authentic existence. The man who had spent his life analyzing the individual's relationship to incomprehensible authority was himself becoming subject to medical and social authorities whose procedures he could observe, but no longer control. Kierkegaard's admission to Frederick's Hospital marked his transition from independent intellectual to dependent patient, a role that violated every principle he had developed about the importance of maintaining personal responsibility for one's existence. Yet, even in this condition of enforced passivity, his mind remained relentlessly active, analyzing the psychological dynamics of medical authority while experiencing firsthand the reduction of individual complexity to clinical categories that his insurance work had taught him to recognize and critique. Dr. Emil Boesen, who had been Kierkegaard's friend since university days and was now serving as hospital chaplain, became his primary companion during the final weeks of life. Their conversations revealed Kierkegaard's continued intellectual vigor combined with spiritual peace that surprised observers who had expected death to intensify the anxiety and despair that had characterized his philosophical investigations. He seemed to have achieved resolution of existential conflicts that his published works had analyzed without resolving. The hospital ward where Kierkegaard spent his final weeks provided him with first-hand observation of how institutional medicine processed human suffering into administrative categories. He could observe other patients' responses to serious illness while experiencing his own physical deterioration with the analytical detachment that had characterized his approach to all forms of human experience. Death itself became material for philosophical investigation. Kierkegaard's refusal to receive communion from the official state church representatives who visited him represented his final public statement about the incompatibility between authentic Christianity and institutional religion. He maintained that individual spiritual relationship with God could not be mediated through ecclesiastical authorities who had accommodated religious truth to social and political convenience. This decision created additional controversy while confirming his commitment to principles that had guided his intellectual career. The physical symptoms that accompanied his final illness, difficulty breathing, irregular heartbeat, gradual loss of speech, created ironic contrast with the intellectual clarity he maintained until nearly the end of his life. The man whose greatest fear had been the loss of mental capacity was experiencing bodily breakdown while his consciousness remained remarkably clear and focused on ultimate questions about meaning and spiritual destiny. Emil Boesen's notes from their hospital conversations documented Kierkegaard's reflection on his literary career and its relationship to his personal spiritual development. He expressed satisfaction with having maintained intellectual honesty about ultimate questions, while acknowledging that his philosophical investigations had created forms of isolation that prevented him from experiencing some of the human connections that might have enriched both his personal life and his intellectual understanding. The news of Kierkegaard's hospitalization spread through Copenhagen's intellectual circles and generated complicated responses that reflected the ambivalent relationship between his public reputation and private spiritual seriousness. Some former friends felt vindicated in their criticism of his attacks on institutional Christianity, while others recognized that his intellectual integrity deserved respect, despite their disagreement with his religious positions. Kierkegaard's financial arrangements during his final weeks revealed his characteristic attention to practical details combined with indifference to material accumulation. He had spent his inheritance supporting his intellectual career rather than building wealth for heirs, but he made careful provisions for paying medical expenses and settling accounts with publishers and creditors. His economic life reflected the same commitment to authentic priorities that had guided his philosophical work. The hospital's routine medical procedures provided Kierkegaard with final examples of how institutional logic operates independently of individual human needs or preferences. Treatment decisions were made according to established protocols rather than patient choice, creating exactly the kind of systematic processing that his philosophical works had identified as characteristic of modern bureaucratic society. Visitors during his final weeks reported that Kierkegaard maintained his intellectual engagement with current events and contemporary literature while expressing increasing indifference to his own literary reputation and influence. He seemed genuinely curious about how his works might affect future readers while accepting that such influence lay beyond his control and should not determine his approach to ultimate spiritual questions. The progression of his illness followed patterns that medical professionals could predict and categorize while remaining personally mysterious to Kierkegaard himself. He experienced the gap between clinical knowledge about disease processes and individual experience of dying that illustrated broader themes about the limitations of systematic understanding when applied to existential realities. Dr. Bosson's accounts suggest that Kierkegaard's final weeks involved psychological integration of intellectual insights that his philosophical career had developed while maintaining focus on spiritual questions that transcended academic philosophy. He seemed to have achieved peace about the relationship between his thinking and his existence that had been the central concern of his mature philosophical work. The gradual loss of physical capacities that accompanied his final illness created opportunities for reflection on the relationship between embodied consciousness and spiritual identity that his philosophical anthropology had explored theoretically. He was experiencing personally the questions about self-continuity and spiritual significance that the sickness unto death had analyzed systematically. Kierkegaard's death on November 11, 1855, at 11 o'clock in the evening, occurred with Emil Bosson in attendance. His final conscious act was refusing pain medication that might have impaired his mental clarity during the transition from temporal to eternal existence. The man who had spent his intellectual career exploring the relationship between time and eternity maintained analytical consciousness until the moment when analysis itself became impossible. The immediate aftermath of Kierkegaard's death revealed how completely his public campaign against institutional Christianity had isolated him from conventional Danish society. Church authorities initially refused him proper burial services, while newspaper accounts emphasized his criticism of organized religion rather than his intellectual achievements or spiritual seriousness. Death did not immediately restore him to social respectability. Søren Kierkegaard died having achieved intellectual integrity about ultimate questions while accepting complete social isolation as necessary cost of authentic existence. His final collapse represented not defeat, but completion of a life devoted to the proposition that existential truth requires forms of commitment that transcend rational justification while demanding personal responsibility for choices that cannot be validated through external authority. The funeral of Søren Kierkegaard on November 18, 1855, it became a final battleground over the meaning of his life and the validity of his attack on institutional Christianity. Church authorities, seeking to minimize the embarrassment of burying a critic who had spent his final year denouncing their accommodation to worldly values, arranged for a quiet service with minimal public attendance. But Henry Lund, Kierkegaard's nephew, seized the opportunity to deliver a graveside speech that transformed the burial into political demonstration supporting his uncle's religious position while challenging the church's authority to define authentic Christian commitment. The crowd that gathered at Assisen Cemetery included curious observers who wanted to witness the final chapter of Copenhagen's most controversial intellectual drama, sympathizers who had been influenced by Kierkegaard's religious writings, and hostile critics who viewed his death as evidence that religious extremism leads inevitably to social isolation and personal destruction. The diverse composition of mourners reflected the complex and conflicted response that Kierkegaard's career had generated among educated Danes. Henrik Lund's funeral address created additional scandal by using the occasion to continue Kierkegaard's attack on Christendom rather than seeking reconciliation between the deceased and the religious authorities he had opposed. Lund read passages from Kierkegaard's pamphlets while arguing that authentic Christianity required exactly the kind of institutional criticism that his uncle had practiced despite its social costs. The funeral became theological and political statement rather than conventional religious ceremony. The immediate journalistic response to Kierkegaard's death revealed how completely his public campaign against institutional Christianity had overshadowed recognition of his intellectual achievements and philosophical innovations. Newspaper accounts emphasized his criticism of church authorities while largely ignoring his contributions to psychology, aesthetics, and existential philosophy that would eventually establish his international reputation. The Church's decision to provide Christian burial despite Kierkegaard's rejection of institutional authority reflected complex calculations about maintaining social order while avoiding additional public controversy. Denying burial might have created martyrdom that would validate his criticism of ecclesiastical politics, while providing conventional funeral services suggested that his opposition had been incorporated into institutional procedures rather than taken seriously as theological challenge. The private papers and manuscripts that Kierkegaard left behind revealed the extent of his intellectual productivity during his final years and provided materials for posthumous publications that would gradually establish his reputation as major philosophical and theological thinker. His notebooks contained analyses of contemporary European politics, drafts for additional works on religious psychology, and personal reflections that illuminated the relationship between his public intellectual career and private spiritual development. The financial accounting of Kierkegaard's estate demonstrated how completely he had devoted his inherited resources to supporting intellectual work rather than accumulating wealth for family members. He had spent nearly his entire patrimony on publishing expenses, book purchases, and living costs that enabled complete independence from conventional employment or social obligations. His economic choices reflected the same commitment to authentic priorities that characterized his philosophical positions. The international context surrounding Kierkegaard's death included revolutionary political movements across Europe that were challenging traditional religious and political authorities while creating new forms of social organization based on democratic and nationalist principles. His criticism of institutional Christianity anticipated similar challenges to ecclesiastical authority that would emerge throughout Protestant Europe during the subsequent decades. The immediate Danish response to Kierkegaard's death reflected broader cultural tensions between traditional religious authority and modern intellectual freedom that would continue developing throughout the 19th century. His career had crystallized conflicts between individual conscience and institutional religion that were affecting all European societies as they navigated relationships between inherited faith and modern scholarship. The personal effects that Kierkegaard left behind: books filled with annotations, furniture arranged to support solitary intellectual work, clothing that reflected indifference to social fashion provided material evidence of how completely he had organized his daily existence around philosophical investigation and religious reflection rather than conventional social participation or professional advancement. The influence of Kierkegaard's intellectual career on younger Danish writers and thinkers began emerging almost immediately after his death, as individuals who had been influenced by his works started developing their own approaches to aesthetic, ethical, and religious questions. Georg Brandes and other cultural critics recognized that Kierkegaard had introduced forms of psychological analysis and religious investigation that would reshape Scandinavian intellectual life. The theological implications of Kierkegaard's death extended beyond immediate Danish context to fundamental questions about the relationship between prophetic religious criticism and institutional church authority that would affect Christian communities throughout the modern period. His career provided precedent for religious thinkers who challenged ecclesiastical accommodation to secular values while maintaining commitment to spiritual authenticity. The gradual recognition that Kierkegaard's philosophical investigations had anticipated psychological and social developments that would characterize modern European culture established his posthumous reputation as prophet rather than merely critic. His analysis of anxiety, despair, and authentic existence proved relevant for understanding cultural conditions that emerged throughout industrialized societies during the later 19th and 20th centuries. The preservation of Kierkegaard's literary remains by family members and friends ensured that his intellectual contributions would receive serious scholarly attention, despite the hostile reception that his final public campaign had generated among Danish church authorities and social conservatives. The manuscripts provided materials for comprehensive evaluation of his philosophical system and religious psychology. The transformation of Kierkegaard's Copenhagen residence into literary shrine reflected growing recognition of his cultural significance, while demonstrating how intellectual achievement can achieve forms of social validation that were denied during his lifetime. Visitors could observe the domestic arrangements that had supported philosophical work while gaining appreciation for the personal costs that serious intellectual investigation required. The ongoing debates about Kierkegaard's religious position revealed fundamental disagreements about the relationship between institutional Christianity and authentic spiritual development that would continue affecting Protestant theology throughout the modern period. His critique of Christendom established framework for evaluating ecclesiastical authority that influenced subsequent religious reform movements. The literary influence of Kierkegaard's stylistic innovations began appearing in works by European writers who had discovered how philosophical insight could be combined with aesthetic sophistication in ways that neither systematic philosophy nor conventional literature could achieve independently. His demonstration of how intellectual seriousness could be combined with literary artistry influenced development of modernist literature. Søren Kierkegaard died having posed questions about authentic existence, religious commitment, and individual responsibility that his historical period could not adequately answer, but that subsequent generations would recognize as essential for understanding modern consciousness. His intellectual career had transformed personal psychological struggles into universal insights about human nature and spiritual development that transcended their immediate cultural context while remaining relevant for contemporary existential investigation. Essay: The Prophet of Inwardness. Within a generation of Søren Kierkegaard's death, European intellectuals began recognizing that the eccentric Danish writer who had died in social isolation had actually provided the most penetrating analysis of modern consciousness and spiritual crisis that their century had produced. By 1900, translations of his major works were appearing across Europe, and philosophers, theologians, and literary critics were discovering how his exploration of anxiety, authenticity, and existential choice had anticipated cultural developments that were reshaping civilization itself. The transformation began in Germany, where scholars like Georg Brandes introduced Kierkegaard's psychological analyses to intellectual circles that were grappling with the implications of Nietzsche's critique of traditional values and the emergence of new forms of consciousness that no longer fit within conventional religious or philosophical frameworks. Kierkegaard's exploration of how individuals navigate ultimate questions without external guidance provided conceptual vocabulary that German thinkers needed for understanding their own cultural situation. World War created historical circumstances that made Kierkegaard's insights about anxiety, despair, and authentic commitment urgently relevant for populations who found themselves confronting existential situations that traditional cultural authorities could not adequately address. Soldiers facing death in trenches, civilians witnessing social collapse, and intellectuals questioning inherited assumptions about progress and rationality discovered in Kierkegaard's work psychological analyses that spoke directly to their experience. Karl Barth and other Protestant theologians developed what became known as crisis theology by applying Kierkegaard's critique of institutional Christianity to problems of modern religious consciousness. Barth's emphasis on divine transcendence and human finitude drew directly on Kierkegaard's analysis of the qualitative distinction between temporal and eternal existence. This theological movement restored prophetic dimensions to Christianity while challenging liberal Protestant accommodation to secular culture. The emergence of psychoanalysis as scientific discipline during the early 20th century created intellectual context that made Kierkegaard's psychological investigations seem prophetic rather than merely literary. Freud's exploration of unconscious mental processes and his analysis of anxiety, guilt, and neurotic symptoms validated Kierkegaard's insight that human consciousness involves layers of self-deception and repression that systematic thinking could not adequately address. Martin Heidegger's philosophical exploration of being toward death and authentic existence, drew extensively on Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety and temporal consciousness while developing these insights into comprehensive ontology that influenced subsequent continental philosophy. Heidegger recognized Kierkegaard as the thinker who had first identified authentic existence as a philosophical problem requiring new forms of phenomenological investigation rather than systematic metaphysical solution. Jean-Paul Sartre and other existentialist philosophers claimed Kierkegaard as an intellectual ancestor while developing his insights about freedom, responsibility, and authentic choice into secular philosophical positions that eliminated religious dimensions while maintaining focus on individual existence and personal commitment. Sartre's famous declaration that existence precedes essence reflected Kierkegaardian understanding that human beings create themselves through choices that cannot be justified through rational argument. The development of existential psychology and psychotherapy during the mid-20th century applied Kierkegaard's insights about anxiety and authentic existence to clinical practice with individuals who were struggling with depression, anxiety, and existential meaninglessness. Therapists like Rollo May and Viktor Frankl found that Kierkegaard's analysis of the spiritual crisis provided a more adequate framework for understanding psychological suffering than purely medical approaches that treated existential problems as pathological symptoms.